R. The dog had not allowed a single human hand to touch him in 31 days. And now, standing in the fluorescent gloom of the Rideau Valley Animal Rehabilitation Center, Simone Vachon was running out of time. "We've exhausted every protocol I know." Vachon tapped the edge of her clipboard against the steel observation rail. Asian. Her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. She had earned that right. Advanced degrees from the Ontario Veterinary College, a fellowship at the University of Edinburgh's Royal Dick School, and a client list that included RCMP service dogs, border agency canines, and the personal pets of at least 3 sitting members of Parliament. She was not a woman who admitted defeat easily, and the admission cost her something visible, a tightening around her jaw, a flicker of something wounded behind her steel-gray eyes. "He's been assessed by Dr. Farhadi's team from Guelph. We had a teleconference with the Canadian Forces Veterinary Unit out of Petawawa, and I personally consulted with a canine PTSD specialist from the Tufts program in Boston. Conclusion is unanimous. Odin is in a terminal grief spiral. He's not declining. He's choosing to die." She looked at the man standing beside her, and for a moment, her professional composure wavered. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Aldridge, the young former master corporal who volunteered at the center on weekends, had been insistent, almost frantic, in his request. He'd heard about someone, an old man up near Arnprior, a name passed around in quiet conversations at the Legion Hall. A man who apparently had a way with dogs that had seen the worst of things. Action calm. But Sean had agreed to the meeting because Jamie was a good kid who'd done 2 tours in Latvia with the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group and still flinched at car backfires. And because she had nothing left to lose. But now, looking at the figure beside her, she felt a cold drip of doubt. He was tall but stooped at the shoulders, the way old trees lean into a prevailing wind. His face was a topographic map of years. Deep seams cut by weather and time, the skin tanned to the color of old pine bark. He wore a canvas jacket so faded it had forgotten its original color. Heavy wool trousers with a permanent crease ironed by decades of habit, and boots that had been resoled so many times, the uppers and the lowers seemed to belong to different centuries. Hands hung loose at his sides, large and scarred, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the fingers slightly curved as if permanently shaped around the handle of a tool. His name was Malcolm Hurst, and he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a retired carpenter from a small town in the Ottawa Valley, a man whose most exciting weekly event was the Saturday morning coffee at the Arnprior Tim Hortons. "Appreciate the briefing, Doctor." His voice was unhurried, low, the consonants worn smooth by a lifetime of Eastern Ontario drawl. He wasn't looking at Vachon or her clipboard. Eyes were fixed on the end of the hallway, where a reinforced kennel sat in absolute silence. The other dog in the block contributed to the general din of barking and whining and the scrape of claws on concrete. That kennel was a void, a pocket of nothing. "Mind if I go have a look at him?" Jamie Aldridge stood a few steps behind them, his hands jammed into the pockets of his volunteer vest. He was trying to look casual and failing badly. He had pulled strings for this. Called in a favor from old Warrant Officer Chicken Savard at the Arnprior Legion, who'd called in a favor from someone else. And somewhere in that chain of quiet requests, Ophir, the name Malcolm Hurst had surfaced, like a stone turning over in a riverbed. "Doesn't fix them," Savard had said, his voice dropping to that particular register old soldiers use when they're telling you something important. He just reminds them what they are. Jamie hadn't known what that meant. He still didn't. But he'd seen Odin, and he'd seen what Odin was doing to himself, and he was willing to try anything. Dog was a German shepherd. 105 pounds of muscle and bone and disciplined fury, now reduced to a motionless shape at the back of a concrete enclosure. He was an explosive detection dog, Ed, who'd served 3 rotations in Mali, with the Canadian Armed Forces contribution to the United Nations peacekeeping mission. His handler, Master Corporal Sean Faulkner, had been killed 4 months ago by an improvised explosive device on a road outside Gao. Irony was not lost on anyone. The dog trained to find bombs had lost his person to the very thing he was supposed to detect. Faulkner had been walking point, ahead of the dog, a suspected cache. He'd told Odin to stay. The dog had obeyed. The dog had always obeyed. And then the road had opened up and swallowed his handler whole. Odin had been left sitting in the red dust, waiting for a command that would never come, and repatriated to Canada. Processed through the military working dog program at CFB Edmonton, and eventually transferred to Vachan's facility when it became clear that no standard rehabilitation protocol was working. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't engage. He wouldn't make eye contact with any human. At the back of his kennel, his massive head resting on his forepaws, staring at the concrete wall with the fixed, unblinking gaze of a sentry, watching a horizon that no longer existed. 3 times a day, food was placed in his kennel. 3 times a day, it was removed untouched. The IV drip they'd used to keep him hydrated in the first 2 weeks had been removed when he'd torn it out with his teeth, the only act of volition he'd displayed since arriving. Vachan sighed, a controlled exhalation through her nose. "Mr. Hurst, I want to be transparent with you. We've tried everything. Therapy, counter-conditioning, pharmaceutical intervention. We even brought in a female shepherd from a breeding program to attempt a social stimulus. Nothing. His cortisol levels are through the roof, but his behavioral output is flatline. He's awake, he's aware, but he's chosen to disengage from the world entirely." She paused, choosing her next words with care, respectfully. "I'm not sure what you think sitting near him will accomplish that 3 certified veterinary behaviorists and a pharmacological protocol couldn't." Hurst nodded slowly, considering this. His gaze hadn't moved from the end of the hallway. "I expect you're right, Doctor. Probably won't accomplish a thing." He said it without irony, without false modesty. It was a simple statement of probability from a man who seemed entirely comfortable with uncertainty. "I drove an hour to get here, and the truck's already parked. Might as well sit for a while." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet finality that closed the door on further debate without ever raising his voice. Vachan found herself doing something she almost never did. She stepped aside. Jamie brought him a folding metal chair from the supply room. Down with a nod, carried it down the corridor with the careful, balanced gait of a man, conscious of every sound his body made, and set it up about 12 feet from Odin's kennel. Not in front of it. Off to the side, angled so that his body was oriented toward the opposite wall, not toward the dog. He sat down, settled his weight, and placed his hands flat on his thighs. Then he did nothing. Aishan watched from the observation window at the end of the block, her tablet open to the live feed from the kennel camera. Heart rate, 62. Respiration, 12. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't twitched. The old man sat in his chair like a piece of furniture, his breathing so slow. And even that, after 10 minutes, the closest dogs had stopped barking and settled into an uneasy quiet as if his stillness was a contagion spreading through the block. 20 minutes. 30. An hour. Ampersy. Vachan pulled up the behavioral analytics on her tablet and scrolled through the data with increasing frustration. Nothing. No change in any metric. The old man was sitting there like a post, and the dog was ignoring him with the same totality he ignored everything else. She felt a familiar ache behind her eyes, the particular headache of professional helplessness. Aided her career to understanding animal cognition, to building bridges between human intention and animal need, And this dog was the wall she couldn't climb over. It was personal now. She cared about Odin, genuinely and deeply, but that caring was tangled with her own sense of professional identity in ways she wasn't entirely comfortable examining. As pointless, she murmured to Jamie, who was leaning against the corridor wall with his arms crossed, watching the old man through the glass. Presence alone isn't a therapeutic intervention. A mannequin in that chair and get the same result. Jamie didn't respond immediately. He was watching Hurst's hands. They rested on his thighs, palms down, fingers relaxed. There's no tremor, no fidgeting, no unconscious drumming of fingers. They were absolutely, preternaturally still. I'd seen hands like that, exactly once before, on a joint terminal attack controller during a live fire exercise at Wainwright, Appy Fields, hands that could hold a laser designator steady on a target for hours in conditions that would make most people shake themselves apart. "Give him time, Doc," Jamie said quietly. "Please." 90-minute mark, something happened. It was so small that Vachon almost missed it on the camera feed. Odin's left ear, the one facing away from Hurst, rotated backward, a fractional movement, a few degrees at most, the kind of micro-adjustment a dog makes when it's tracking a sound it can't quite identify. It held for perhaps 5 seconds, turned to its neutral position. Vachon stared at her screen. She replayed the footage, zoomed in. There it was. The first voluntary movement the dog had made in over a week. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to be clinical. It could be nothing. An involuntary response to a distant sound. A muscle twitch. Was not causation. And she was not about to build a theory on a single ear movement. But she couldn't leave. She pulled up a chair of her own and settled in to watch. Another hour passed. Hurst remained motionless. The shadows in the kennel block shifted as the afternoon sun moved across the high, narrow windows. The smell of bleach and dog and concrete hung in the air like a permanent weather system. At some point, a volunteer came through with a mop and bucket, cleaning the aisle in front of the empty kennels. The wheels of the bucket squeaked on the floor. In his kennel, Odin's body tensed, a subtle bunching of muscle along his spine and shoulders, and a low sound emerged from his chest. Not quite a growl, more like the rumble of distant thunder heard through thick walls. On the camera feed, Vachon watched Odin's heart rate jump from 60 to 115 in 3 seconds. Hurst moved. It was the first time he'd shifted in nearly 2 hours. And the movement was so controlled, so minimal, that if Vachon hadn't been watching the live feed at that exact moment, just would have missed it entirely. He lifted his right hand from his thigh, turned the palm downward, and lowered it slowly back to his knee. The gesture took perhaps 2 seconds. There was no sound, verbal cue, no change in his posture or breathing, rising and falling like the slow beat of a wing. The rumble in Odin's chest stopped. On the screen, Vachon watched the heart rate graph plummet. 115, 90, 75, 68. Under 20 seconds, the dog's entire autonomic nervous system had stood down. Not the gradual decline of a natural startle recovery, which would take minutes. A switch, flipped off, Asian fools. Vachon set her tablet down very carefully on the table beside her, as if it were made of glass. At Jamie. Jamie was staring at Hurst with an expression she couldn't quite read. Respect, certainly, but something else. Recognition. "What just happened?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He gave him a stand-down signal," Jamie said. His voice was strange, tight. "I've seen signals like that before. Not that exact one. But the grammar of it, cadence. That's not obedience school, Doc. Operational." Hurst sat in his chair. His hands returned to their resting position, his gaze still fixed on the opposite wall. He gave no indication that anything had occurred. The volunteer with the mop finished her work and left, oblivious. For the rest of the afternoon, Vashon didn't move from her observation post. She watched. She documented. She tried to fit what she was seeing into the framework of her training, and found, with a growing sense of vertigo, that the framework didn't have a category for this. At 4:30, Hurst reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and took out a small bundle wrapped in wax paper. He unfolded it on his knee, revealing several strips of dried meat, dark and rough-textured, clearly homemade. He took a piece, put it in his mouth, and began to chew slowly, his jaw working with the patient rhythm of a man who had nowhere else to be. The smell reached Vakan's observation window within a minute. It was rich, smoky, layered, the scent of hardwood and salt and cured protein. It was the antithesis of the sterile, processed environment of the center. It smelled like outside, open air and wood smoke in autumn. In his kennel, Odin's nose moved, a single twitch. Then another, the black nostrils flaring as they processed this new information. Then, for the first time in 31 days, the dog lifted his head. Not much. 2 inches, perhaps 3. He lifted it off his paws and held it there. His nose working the air, his eyes still unfocused, but his body, for the first time, oriented towards something in the present rather than something in the past. Vashon's hand went to her mouth. Efters. Hastened to chew his dried meat, unhurried, his eyes still averted from the dog. He finished the first piece, took another, ate it the same way. He was not performing. He was not strategizing. Epi Fields. He was simply a man eating his afternoon snack in a quiet hallway. After the third piece, he took a fourth from the wax paper, leaned forward slightly, and placed it on the concrete floor about 6 feet in front of his chair. He leaned back, refolded the wax paper, returned it to his pocket, and placed his hands on his thighs again. The piece of meat sat on the gray floor, like small dark offering. Odin's head was fully up now. His eyes, which had been dull and vacant for weeks, held something sharp and alive. He was looking at the meat, but he was also looking at the man. The dog was reading him, Vashon realized, running through an assessment that was equal parts instinct and training. Threat level. Intent. Fidelity. The old man passed every test by doing nothing at all. He was static. He was calm. He was not trying to be anything other than what he was. 5 minutes passed. 10. Odin did not move from his position at the back of the kennel. But he did not lower his head either. He held his vigil. Eyes moving between the meat and the man, Vashon understood that she was watching a negotiation conducted in a language she did not speak. At 5 o'clock, Hurst stood up. Eints popped audibly. A cascade of small sounds that made Jamie wince in sympathy. He picked up the piece of dried meat from the floor, walked slowly to the kennel door, and slid it under the chain link, just about a foot inside. Then he folded his chair, tucked it under his arm, and walked back down the corridor. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said to Vakan and Jamie, his voice carrying no particular emphasis. Same time. Don't change anything about his routine. One person for water. One person for food. Quiet. No talking near his kennel. He's listening to everything, and right now everything is too loud. He nodded to them both and walked out into the late afternoon light. The sound of a truck engine coughing to life drifted through the walls, followed by the crunch of gravel, and then silence. Vashon and Jamie walked to Odin's kennel. The dog had retreated to his usual position, head on paws, eyes fixed on the wall. He had not gone all the way to the back corner. He was lying about 2 feet closer to the front than he had been that morning. And the piece of dried meat that Hurst had pushed under the door was gone. The next morning, Hurst arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. He brought his own chair this time, a battered wooden thing with a woven seat that looked like it had been in his family since Confederation, up directly in front of Odin's kennel, no more than 4 feet from the chain link, and sat down. Odin was already at the front of his kennel, lying with his head on his paws. When the old man appeared, the dog's tail moved. A single slow sweep across the concrete, barely a whisper of motion, but it was there. Jamie, watching from the corridor, felt his throat tighten. Hurst sat for 2 hours, ate his dried meat, as peace inside the kennel, and Odin ate it immediately this time, without hesitation, without the long, agonized assessment of the day before. Then Hurst began to speak. His voice was so low that Jamie, standing 15 feet away, could only catch fragments. The tone was conversational, unhurried, the cadence of a man talking to an equal. Not the high-pitched, exaggerated voice people use with animals. Not the clinical, measured tone of a trainer issuing commands. Just talk, the way 2 old soldiers might talk over coffee, sharing the comfortable silence between sentences as much as the words themselves. Heavy thing to carry. I know. Nobody asking you to put it down. Just shift the weight a little, that's all. Did your job. Did it well. He knew that. Don't need to prove it anymore. Vachan listened to the fragments and felt something shift in her understanding. A tonic movement, slow and deep, deaf ear. She had spent her career learning the science of animal behavior, the neurochemistry of attachment, the measurable parameters of stress and recovery. She believed in data. She believed in protocols. Everything she believed was failing this dog. This old man, with his homemade jerky and his silence and his low, rumbling voice, was reaching something she couldn't see on any of her charts as working. On the 3rd day, Hurst asked for the key to the kennel. Ing felt the blood leave her face. Mr. Hurst, Malcolm, that dog is 105 pounds of elite military training. He has advanced bite work in his background. His triggers are completely unmapped. If he decides you're a threat, he will go for your throat, and there is nothing any of us can do to stop him in time. Hurst looked at her with those pale, steady eyes. There was patience in them, and something else. Something that looked very much like the quiet amusement of a man who has faced considerably worse odds than an unhappy dog and knows it. He won't, Hurst said. It wasn't a prediction. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty a man might use, to say the sun would rise in the east. Jamie stepped forward. I'll stand by with the catchpole, Doc. A case. Vachan looked from one man to the other. She thought about liability, about her professional reputation. She thought about the dog lying in that kennel, starving himself to death, with the disciplined patience of a soldier on a hunger strike, and she thought about the fact that in 3 days, an old carpenter from Arnprior had achieved more than her entire team had managed in a month. She handed him the key. As Hurst approached the kennel door the way Jamie had once seen a bomb disposal tech approach an IED, not with fear, but with a profound, almost ceremonial respect for what he was walking toward. He didn't face the door directly. He turned his body at an angle, presenting his shoulder rather than his chest, inserted the key into the lock with his left hand. He turned it but didn't open the door. He rested his palm flat against the chain link and stood there for a long moment, his breath slow and audible. The edge of the dog absorbed every molecule of information his body was broadcasting. Scent, intent, heartbeat. Then he opened the door and stepped inside. He didn't approach Odin. He walked to the back of the kennel, checked the water nozzle, gave the blanket a shake to fluff it, and ran his hand along the wall as if inspecting the quarters. His movements were calm, purposeful, and utterly lacking in the tentative caution that every other human who'd entered the space had displayed. As he wasn't a visitor. He was conducting an inspection. He lowered himself to the floor, his back against the side wall, his legs extended, and waited. Odin watched him. The dog hadn't moved from his spot near the front of the kennel, but his entire body was oriented toward the old man. His ears were forward, his eyes sharp, his nostrils working. He was making a decision. It took 4 minutes. The dog stood, shook himself once from nose to tail, a full-body shudder that sent a fine mist of dust and loose fur into the air, and walked to where Hurst sat. He didn't sit beside him. He turned, lowered himself to the floor, and pressed his back against Hurst's leg. He faced the open kennel door, his head erect, his eyes on the corridor beyond. A sentry, assuming his post, but leaning against someone, no longer alone on the wall. Hurst brought his hand up slowly. Not from above, not reaching over the dog's head, but from below, underneath the jaw, and scratched the thick muscle there with blunt, gentle fingers. Odin's eyes closed. A sound came from him, a deep, shuddering exhalation that seemed to carry more than air, that seemed to carry weeks of rigid, suffocating grief out of his body in a single breath. It was harder into Hurst's leg, and made a sound that Vashon, watching through the chain link, with tears running freely down her face, could only describe as a groan of relief. Hurst spoke to him. His voice was barely audible. A low murmur that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and the words were simple and direct, and carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. You held the line, son. You held it. No one could ask for more than that. Ask for more than that. Time to stand down now. Time to come in from the cold. Then Hurst's left hand moved. It was a quick, precise gesture, a configuration of fingers followed by a tap against his own collarbone, so fast and compact that if Jamie had blinked, he would have missed it entirely. But he didn't blink, and he saw it, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow. He'd seen signals like that exactly once, in a classified briefing video during his time at the Canadian Forces School of Intelligence and Security in Kingston. Non-standard, unit-specific, the kind of silent communication developed by teams that operated in places where sound meant death. A flick of two fingers could mean the difference between a successful extraction and a body bag. Teams that didn't officially exist. Further, teams that operated under the umbrella of Joint Task Force 2 and the even more shadowy elements that supported them. He was not looking at a carpenter from Arnprior. In the kennel, Odin's response was immediate and absolute. The dog's entire demeanor transformed. His head came up. His ears locked forward. His body went rigid, with a focused, purposeful alertness that was fundamentally different from the tension of fear or aggression. It was the posture of a dog awaiting an order. Back on duty. Hurst spoke a single word. It was short, sharp, guttural. Not English, not French. It sounded Dutch, or perhaps Flemish, a clipped syllable that cracked through the air of the kennel like a small caliber round. Loss. Odin broke his rigid posture. He shook himself again, a vigorous, full-body shake, and then he did something no one in the building had seen him do. Pressed his nose into Hurst's palm, sniffed once, and licked the scarred, weathered skin of the old man's hand. The vigil was over. Hurst stayed in the kennel for another hour, just a stiff, bristled brush from inside his jacket, and began grooming the dog, working through the dull, neglected coat with slow, thorough strokes. He talked the entire time, his voice a steady, low current of words that Jamie and Vachin could only catch in fragments, but the tone was unmistakable. It's the tone of a debrief, of one professional speaking to another at the end of a long, hard deployment. When he finally stood, Odin stood with him. Hurst walked to the door, stepped out, and did not protest. He sat at the front of the kennel, upright, alert, his eyes tracking the old man down the corridor, waiting, patient, but alive. Hurst locked the door and handed the key to Vachin, with hands that were not entirely steady. "He'll eat tonight," Hurst said. "Arm his kibble with some low-sodium broth. Not too much. His stomach's been empty a long time. Small portions, 3 times a day. Build it up slow." He looked at Jamie. "Walk him tomorrow. Short lead, heel position. He needs the routine back. He's been missing the structure more than the food." Vachin wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. not caring about professionalism, about anything, except the dog she'd been watching die for a month, who was now sitting upright in his kennel, with something like purpose in his eyes. Malcolm, how? How did you know what to do? That signal, that word, that's not in any manual I've ever read. I've consulted with the military working dog program. I've read every paper, every protocol. Just isn't in any of them. Hurst looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not unkind, but there was a depth to it, a layered quality, like looking into water that seems shallow until you notice you can't see the bottom. Some things aren't in papers, Doctor, he said. His voice was quiet. Fields. Some work gets done in places where nobody writes anything down. The dogs that do that work, and the men who work beside them, they learn a different language. Not commands, yet tricks. A language of trust, absolute trust. The kind you build when the only thing between you and a very bad night is the animal beside you and the man in front of you. He paused, and for a moment, Aziz went somewhere far away, to a place that existed only in memory and in the classified files of agencies that would neither confirm nor deny his involvement. That dog's not broken, he said, his eyes back to the present. He's mourning. There's a world of difference. A trained mourning out of a soldier, and you can't medicate it out of a dog. You just have to sit with him in it. Let him know he's not the last one standing. Then, when he's ready, you give him a reason to get back on his feet. He looked toward the kennel, where Odin sat watching him. His reason was his handler. When that was taken, everything else was just noise. Desert. All I did was turn the volume down long enough for him to hear something new. He gave a small nod, the kind of abbreviated gesture that said more than a handshake, and turned toward the exit. His boots made their soft, steady sound on the concrete, the footsteps of a man who had learned long ago to move through the world without leaving marks. After he was gone, Aw stood in the corridor and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, JTF2, maybe before that, something we don't have a name for. Vachan didn't ask what he meant. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. What she knew was that everything she'd been taught, every protocol she'd developed, a paper she'd published, had approached Odin as a system to be repaired. Hurst had approached him as a soul to be understood. And the difference, she was beginning to realize, was not a matter of method. It was a matter of everything. Jamie prepared a bowl of kibble according to Hurst's instructions. Warm water. A splash of low-sodium beef broth. He carried it to Odin's kennel and set it down inside the door without a word, without eye contact, without the desperate, hopeful energy that had accompanied every previous feeding attempt. Odin stood. He walked to the bowl with a measured, dignified pace, lowered his head, and to eat, slowly, deliberately. Anne sits down to his first meal after a long, hard journey, knowing that the road behind him was brutal but that he survived it, and that the road ahead, while uncertain, was at least a road and not a wall. His long watch was over. He was coming home.